Okay, back again for the last slide. There are two figures that are important to talk about in the 4th century church, and that's Jerome and Augustine. Jerome it was a scholar, a church father, a leader, a pastor, but he was tasked or given the job of translating the multiple different uh, copies of Scripture into one single translation. Um, so at this point, there are lots of different copies and translations in Latin and Greek circulating around the church. But as we again move out into the open, the church becomes more standardized. There is a need to create a standard translation of the Bible. So this job is given to Jerome, and his translation becomes known as the Vulgate, and it is the standard. So it is the Latin translation. So he takes all these hodgepodge translations and puts it together in Latin, and is known as the Vulgate, which becomes the official church translation of the Roman Catholic Church for centuries. So again, you've got the idea of the Vulgate here. I've written it here as well. That is the name of the translation. Jerome then, in order to complete his translation, moves to Bethlehem. This is kind of unusual for a man in the 4th and 5th century to move out of Europe and back to Bethlehem. But there he comes in contact with or sees copies of the Masoretic text. Remember that? So basically, he sees the Hebrew. And I didn't say this, but remember that all of this would have been translations from the Septuagint. So he has various copies and translations of the Septuagint. He moves to Bethlehem to do his translation, and there he comes in contact with the Masoretic or Hebrew text, and realizes that there are huge differences between the two. And here then, he, being more of a scholar than anything, and so very much an orderly mind, he says anything that's in the Septuagint but not in the Masoretic text, so this is just for the Old Testament part, he takes out and puts it at the back. So basically, Jerome is the one who invents the Apocrypha. So he takes what we now think of as the Old Testament, and if you've got your New Oxford Annotated Bibles, you've got that section called the Apocrypha, and then you have the New Testament. Jerome is the one who, in many ways, created the Apocrypha by noticing the differences between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. So that is his big contribution to the history of Christianity, to the development of Christianity, is this single unified translation, but also the creation of a separation or different ordering. So let me erase that, and we'll talk about Augustine, who is arguably the most important figure in history, in Christian history, after Jesus, obviously, and Paul. But in terms of theologians, probably second, one could argue second only to Paul in his importance for the development of Western Christianity, at least. His influence has been very vast in the Western, so the Roman Catholic and Protestant traditions. So Augustine was born in a town called Hippo, which is in North Carolina. No, it's not North Carolina. It's in North Africa. So he is of North African origin. He is born into a pagan family. Well, actually, his father was a pagan, but his mother was a Christian. But his father insisted that he be raised as a pagan. And so he then is very ambitious. He goes through a significant education and becomes a teacher in the Roman Empire. In the ancient world, instead of students coming to teachers, teachers went to students. So he traveled and set up schools in various cities, and basically led a decent pagan lifestyle, I suppose you could think of it. He had a mistress. He talks a lot about that. He had a child with this woman who did not survive to adulthood, um, and he goes on his life, except for his mother, who, even though she was forced to raise him as a pagan, she wants her son to convert to Christianity. So she is after him, and again, literally just saying, "Come to this service with me," or "Do this or do that," so to expose him to Christianity. So that's sort of the family dynamics now. He's going from city to city, establishing these schools. And so, what do we know about him as a person, as a spiritual person? And to be maybe a little oversimplified, but he goes through quite a spiritual quest. He actually practices multiple different religions, as he goes through in his spiritual quest to find meaning in his life. And if you sort of look at what he does, you can get the sense that his driving force in his spiritual pursuit was his sense of personal sinfulness. He very much understands that humans are flawed and that they are sinful and they do the wrong things. So this is sort of his motivating factor in some ways. He is most famous for two books, before we get back to sort of what he does with this. His Confessions. So the Confessions of St. Augustine, probably his most famous book, and it's sort of a memoir. And then The City of God, which is a more philosophical, theological treatise. There are other writings, but these are the ones that get studied the most. And so I wanted, as we sort of connect his importance to his own personal spiritual quest, I want to refer to a story in the Confessions about a pear tree. So he tells a story about himself as a young man, maybe adolescent or teen, and he's at home with his friends, and they are hanging out, and they get bored. And so they jump into the neighbor's yard, and the neighbor has a pear tree, and the pear tree is full and ready to be harvested. And his friends basically just sort of vandalize the tree. They eat what they want to, they destroy what they want, they throw it at things, they just make a general mess of the pear tree. Now, you also have to remember that there's a lot more resting on this, because in the ancient world, you couldn't go down to the Walmart and buy another bag of pears if the ones on your trees get destroyed. This was part of the food source for that family. So he had done a great disservice to them, and perhaps had harmed them in a fairly significant way. And so as he tells the story about himself and ponders it as a theologian, he says, why? Why did I do these things? And he says, did I need the food? Did I do it out of need? No, he came from a well-off family. Did I have something, a vendetta or a grudge against this neighbor, and I had a reason to want to do him harm, and this is how I did it? No, I have no need. I had nothing against this neighbor. So he comes to the conclusion that he did it because that's what people do. People do bad things. It's just who we are. We are sinners. And he said, and this is how he comes up, and his interpretation of Genesis 2 and 3, with the idea of original sin, which is a phrase you may have heard of. So, in his search for his own personal sinfulness, in his spiritual search that seems to be motivated by his sense of his own bad choices, he uses this to illustrate how he gets to this idea of original sin. There was no reason for what he did except that he just felt like it. And it was not a good choice. And so he comes up with this idea of original sin, which is to say that we cannot not sin. It is built into that human nature is by definition sinful. We don't come into the world with the potential, even the potential of not sinning. Augustine comes very close to almost a biological sense that of sin as being passed down from generation to generation in the blood, right? So this idea of original sin, we cannot not sin, and our very nature is sinful. And so as he reads and studies, and I forgot to finish out his life, he does eventually convert to Christianity. His mother keeps at him and introduces him to another very famous church leader of the time, who in discussion and preaching converts Augustine to Christianity. He then becomes he devotes his life to Christianity. He becomes a priest, and then eventually becomes the bishop, goes back to his hometown, and is also known as the Bishop of Hippo, where he is the leader of the city's, the church of the city of Hippo, but also a very, very important leader throughout the entire region. The Bishop of Hippo then, his Confessions, the City of God, and then his idea of original sin. But also, this idea of original sin gives sort of spawn to another belief that we'll come back to, and that is the idea of predestination. So I'm going to erase some of this. We've got, so he dies serving as the Bishop of Hippo in North Africa, and this idea of personal sinfulness, why we just do bad things, right? We are by nature sinful. And so we get to this idea of predestination. So for Augustine, and that word means exactly what it says, in some ways then, our destiny is predetermined. If we cannot not sin, then we are predestined to be sinful. And so this then offers up another question. We've basically just finished settling the issue of the nature of Christ. But with Augustine, we get a new conversation, the nature of our salvation. So Paul, who talks about being saved by faith, we talked about that with Paul's letters. And that's why he, in the letter of the Galatians, he rejects the idea of the need for the law. But Augustine starts to question if faith is enough. The idea of faith and God's grace, how much, or put it differently, how much of our salvation is based on our personal faith, and how much of our salvation is just based on the fact that God is willing to offer it to us no matter what we do or say or think. So then this question of the nature of salvation, another way to think about it is how much power or control do we have over our salvation? How much do we get to choose? And how much is just a gift from God. So it's the power, human power and control versus God's power and control over our salvation. So this then, it becomes the next great question of Christianity. What is it exactly that assures our salvation? This goes back, so again, this idea of original sin is what introduces this into the conversation. Because if we are sinful, then Augustine, if we are by nature sinful, we are born that way, Augustine asks the question, can we even have the power to choose? Do we, or let me rewrite that, do we, in our state of sinfulness, even have the power, let me erase some more of this, have the power to choose? Sorry for the handwriting there. So, and Augustine came down heavily on the side of no. That on the scale between our choice and our power to choose and God's versus our sinfulness, which then heightens God's power, then the answer is no. And we get back then to not only then are we predestined to be sinful, our very salvation is predestined. So what do I mean by that? Even our salvation is God's choice. Or is predestined by God. Now, Augustine didn't go the distance on this. He walks right up to it and basically implies it in his writing, but he never fully forms this full-blown belief in predestination. So, for example, the question always arises, what about babies, right? A baby who may have been born with original sin, but has not actually had the chance to commit a sin, are they predestined to go to hell? And Augustine would have said, no. You actually there is a combination of events and there is mercy in God. So we still have some control or power over our salvation, and is not completely chosen. It is with John Calvin, and I'll just mention this because we'll get to him in when we talk about the Reformation, that we get full-blown predestination as a part of more the Protestant tradition, parts of the Protestant tradition than the Catholic tradition. But Augustine's influence on Roman Catholicism and on Protestantism in general, these are still the questions. He sets the conversation for much of what Christianity looks like in Europe. And therefore in the U.S. when we get there. So Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. So thus ends this section of PowerPoint or videos. See y'all later.